So for the past year, our life has depended so much on public contracts. Supply of masks, tests, vaccines, hospital equipment. The successes or failures of purchases by public authorities punctuate the daily lives of billions of people. As a professor of public contract law, long time obliged to explain to students all the interest there was in being passionate about tendering procedures, I have to admit that I did not ask for such publicity for public procurement. We all have been petrified by the magnitude of the events, forced to think global while worrying about respecting barrier gestures with our neighbors. It is this intellectual gymnastic of everyday life that I would like to mobilize to attempt a forward-looking reflection on the field of international public procurement, which has interested me for several years. I'm here for testing ideas. After all, that's what Bertrand asked us to do with the ambitious title of this program, The Day After. Actually, after acknowledging that the last year masks war was a true failure for public procurement law, I'm going to argue that the vaccine situation may offer some glimpse of hope, at least from a public procurement point of view. So first, the acquisition turmoil during spring 2020, the first failure. I'm going to build on my previous work. The article, which has been distributed, COVID-19 Lessons Learned in Public Procurement, Time for New Normal, was written with my colleague, Professor Chris Hukins, at George Washington University, professor at George Washington University in Government Contract Law, and we highlighted the disruptive effects of the COVID crisis and the upheavals undergone by the fundamental pillars of international public procurement. Indeed, public procurement law is dedicated to govern all types of government contracts. When public money is used by public entities to purchase goods or services needed by the public activities, including defense contracts or health contracts. Public procurement law is a law conceived from the state approach. It remains a law of states operating in their internal markets. For a long time, this was a closed law, a closed field, restricted to limited competition among national producers. The openings that were granted were essentially focused on the more or less wide access granted to foreign suppliers or products. Since the 90s, it is a law that has become internationalized. The European adventure has used it to build the internal market, and the globalization of world trade has pushed it since agreements between states were necessary to open up borders. But the logic remained the same, a logic of closed or open doors according to reciprocity agreements. The approach has remained national and fragmented, often even within the countries themselves. While the rules are getting more harmonized, the states apply more or less the same procedures, at least for the award of the contracts, the binding procedures. However, this law remained national in its spirit. It did not try to organize international public value chains. From this observation, carried out now, meaning ex post, we can understand that the shock of March 2020 was terrible. And this is what we listed, and you can see it on the slide. This temporal disruption with the unprecedented and forced acceleration of purchasing procedures. We had never seen this emergency procedure being so urgent. The competition disruption, which caused an inversion of the characteristic of the public purchasing markets, because usually you have one buyer and several vendors, and actually it was quite more complicated, and it linked to the epistemological disruption, the destruction of assumptions grounded in a monopsonid market with sudden competition between public buyers. The geographic disruption as well was due to the global dimension of the voracious public demand. However, public officers around the world were able to adjust and finally to buy the essential goods, also because there was a collaboration with the private sector, which had reorganized to face the urging demand. But since we should be on the 8th of Saint-Sauveur, sharing a conference with skiing and fondue sessions, let me take you to the other slippery tracks, those of vaccine purchases. The race for vaccines could be considered as a second failure, or maybe just a necessary adjustment. Let's go first to the American side and look for the Operation Warp Speed. Actually, the Trump administration compared the Operation Warp Speed to develop a COVID-19 vaccine to the Manhattan Project, the name of the secretive government project to make the first atomic bomb. It means that the whole operation is still very, very secret. And what is very interesting is to look at this unprecedented effort from a legal point of view, using an innovative legal tools, or maybe actually just using something that was already in the closet. Instead of entering into contracts directly with vaccine makers, more than 6 billion in operative warp speed funding has been routed through a defense contract management firm called Advanced Technologies International Incorporated, ATI. ATI then awarded contracts to companies working on COVID-19 vaccines. The Trump government has been turning to an alternative mechanism called Another Transaction Agreement, or OTA, and these agreements got their starts in the late 50s. So they are not new agreements, and they were created when NASA, the NASA agency was created to streamline the contracting process and attract newer, smaller companies and inventors to work with the government. The Department of Defense, a partner in Operation Warp Speed, already had an overarching OTA with the ATI company. So in March and early April 2020, the Department of Defense talked with ATI about an existing consortium of academics and companies that it managed, called the Medical Defense Consortium. It was tasked with developing medical countermeasures to threat against the military. To expand it for the COVID-19 response was just a matter of adding more money and issuing a request for proposals concerning coronavirus vaccines and other COVID-19 items. So it's a very interesting move from the Defense Department, but not unusual from the US history in government contracting. They are used to activate these huge IDIQ, indefinite delivery quantity contract, and sometimes using them to buy very different things that were supposed to buy at the beginning. The problem with this OTI is actually that it's going really against the FAR rules. The FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It's the principal set of rules regarding government procurement in the United States. It covers many of contracts issued by the US military and NASA, as well as civilian federal agencies. The largest single part of the FAR is Part 52, which contains standard solicitations and also contract clauses. And it is interesting to note that by default, under the FAR, the government owns any invention first created, prototyped, or put into practice in the performance of a government contract. However, it seems that the OTI operation warp speed is quite different, characterized by contractual clauses going against traditional procurement principles, because it's based on the secret going against the principle of transparency. It could be also noticed that it's an abandonment of public bargaining power, because it's a case-by-case negotiation. There is also a renunciation of the monitoring of contracts versus the usual power of control for the public party. And actually, many OTAs, former OTAs, indeed exclude a specific clause which is called the Bayh-Dole clause. And this Bayh-Dole clause is also known as the patent clause, patent rights clause, which, among other things, allow the government to step in and even to take control of a drug or vaccine if a manufacturer that receives federal funding engaged in price gouging, for example. And last exceptional provision, the payment in advance. Because this payment in advance, not only for the research part, but also for the production part, goes against the principle of service accomplished. Then turning to the EU answer, which could be qualified as learning by doing. The first EU answer was indeed too late and too small. The voluntary joint public procurement agreement with the member states allowed the joint purchase of equipment and supplies for just 50 million euros, and so several binding procedures were launched. Then the second answer about purchasing vaccine can be qualified as being too slow. Even if the European Commission presented the EU vaccine strategy in June 2020, it launched the advance purchase agreements later on, and then they are still modifying them on a regular basis. But what is interesting is that both answers have been able to upgrade procurement tools named framework agreements to an unprecedented scale. We had never used such framework agreements among countries in the EU. Just to mention, in 2029, there was a first attempt, called the Joint Procurement Initiative, to regroup the purchase of medical products for hospitals. But it was only between 3 EU countries with 3 hospitals on board. So, of course, the magnitude of the advanced purchase agreements today is really different. So now the difficult question, is the COVID crisis driving us to the abandonment of the principles of public procurement law? I argue that the break that we are seeing is more a break with the national approach of public procurement, and that we are actually witnessing the birth of a continental public procurement law with blocks as markets. European bloc, Northern American bloc, Chinese bloc, Indian bloc. These blocks are made of countries or groups of countries within federal ensemble. I'm talking about the United States with the states level, that are pivoting, adjusting their public purchases to the size of their territory. Regionalism is indeed fading under the massifying effect of the centralization of purchases. And these blocks are more and more incorporating the production phase into their purchasing strategy, They want to control the supply chain production from A to Z by, quote unquote, nationalizing the production part. That is to say, they integrate public purchasing into value chains refocused on their territories. This block-based approach is not asserting itself at the same speed everywhere. Unfortunately, the African bloc is not yet there, but efforts are already noticeable. And the COVAX initiative, which is the group purchase of vaccines for poor countries, paradoxically also reinforce the division of the global procurement market in huge segments. So protectionism is back, but at a continental level. And so the question of protectionism, which was peripheral before 2020, thus now becomes central. Protectionism in buying, with direct and indirect barriers drafted in the US and in the EU, and not only drafted, but also activated sometimes. And protectionism in producing, with export restriction at play, and incidentally, the debate on the availability of COVID vaccines all over the world with nationalized production and restricted licensing. So to conclude, I'm going to ask if this trend, will this trend remain limited to the highly sensitive issue of public health, or will we see the emergence of public value chains in other sectors? The legal tools are there, the framework agreements and sort of. The technological tools are there because they need the IT support for that. But then it will be necessary to see if the political will go into this direction as well. Let's be optimistic. Despite the hiccups, at unprecedented speed, new vaccines were developed and distributed. They mobilize innovative legal tools in the service of interventionism and cooperation between states. Framework agreements now are conducted at the level of continents. As a new challenge, a new mountain rises behind the COVID crisis, the climate crisis. So to fighting it, these tools are going to be needed more than ever. It is through them that macro policies can be implemented at the optimal scale for a real shift towards sustainable development. Thank you.